In this video, we are going to look at the pancreas. We're going to look specifically at the endocrine functions. The pancreas makes two major hormones, insulin and glucagon. So we're going to look at how they're made, why they're made, and how they're regulated, and what happens when regulation goes wrong. The pancreas is located in the posterior portion of the abdominal cavity, just below the stomach. The pancreas has an exocrine function as well as an endocrine function. The pancreas can secrete substances from the acinar cells that will move into a duct that will move into a hollow organ, which is our small intestine. When we are digesting food, the pancreas produces bicarbonate to neutralize the acid from the stomach, and it produces digestive enzymes. We will look at those functions in the digestive system video. This video is going to focus on the hormone production. Insulin, its primary role is to decrease blood sugar. Blood sugar is glucose. And glucagon, which will increase blood glucose. These hormones are produced in endocrine cells called the islets of Langerhans. And there are two cell types in here, and it is the beta cells that produce the insulin and the alpha cells that produce the glucagon. So what affects our blood sugar? Okay, we make insulin when our blood sugar goes up. How does that happen? Right? It's when we eat food. When we eat food, let's suppose we eat a sandwich. That sandwich is going to contain all of our macronutrients. Okay, it'll have protein, carbohydrates, and fats. And when we digest those molecules, we break them down into their individual building blocks. Some of them will be fatty acids, some amino acids, and some sugars like glucose. Each of these nutrients has a different effect on how much insulin is produced. What do you think will increase insulin production the most? Fat, protein, or carbohydrates? Okay, carbohydrates will increase insulin production the most. What do you think will increase it more? A starchy carbohydrate like a potato, or simple carbohydrate like sugar? Okay, sugars. When we consume sugars, it is easy to digest. They absorb into the bloodstream very quickly, increasing blood sugar very quickly. So that will stimulate an increase in insulin production from the pancreas. If I draw a chart here, we have a normal range of blood glucose levels. When we eat food, our blood sugar is going to go up, and then we're going to make insulin and our blood sugar will go down. And we want our blood sugar to stay within this healthy range. So when we eat food and the blood sugar goes up, then we will make insulin, and insulin will make the blood sugar go back down. Now, let's suppose we don't eat for a little while and the blood sugar is going to start dropping. Then we need to make glucagon to bring blood sugar back up so that we're always staying in this normal range when we're a healthy person. Okay, let's compare our different nutrients. If we look at how much insulin is going to be increased, when we eat fats, we're going to have a bit of an insulin release because it tells cells to take up the nutrients so we can either use them or store them for later. If we consume protein, we will have a bit more of an insulin response. And if we consume carbohydrates, then we have even stronger insulin response. And sugar will stimulate the most insulin. In a negative feedback loop, we have a stimulus. There is a specific receptor that will detect that stimulus. The integrating center will determine if that factor is out of the normal range. And then there will be an effector that will cause a response that brings that factor back into the normal range. When we have increased blood sugar as the stimulus, the receptors that detect this change in blood sugar are the chemoreceptors in the pancreas. The integrating center is the pancreas because it will determine if the set point for blood sugar has varied from its normal range. And then the effector is the pancreas. The beta cells in the pancreas produce insulin that will have the response of decreasing blood sugar. So in this example, the pancreas is the receptor, the integrating center, and the effector. When blood sugar is decreased, again, chemoreceptors in the pancreas will detect this. The pancreas is the integrating center. And then the alpha cells in the pancreas make glucagon, and the effect is to increase blood sugar. Now, what causes our blood sugar to increase? Eating food. And different foods will have different effects on how much the blood sugar increases. Eating carbohydrates and sugar will obviously increase blood sugar more than eating protein or fat. What causes decreased blood sugar? There are a couple of things. One is having periods of time when we're not eating. When we are exercising, because we can tell the muscle cells to use glucose to make energy. And also during a stress response, because the body needs to have more blood sugar to make lots of ATP during a stress response. So these three factors are the main things that will cause blood sugar to decrease. So when our blood sugar is up, we've eaten some food, and we need to make insulin to decrease blood sugar. How does insulin decrease blood sugar? What is happening that makes the blood sugar go down? Where is it going? Okay, so blood sugar is moving into the cells. It's leaving the bloodstream and going into the cells. How does glucose get into a cell? Okay, it can't just diffuse. It needs to have a carrier, a membrane protein. So insulin stimulates cells to make glucose transporters. When the glucose transporters are on the cell membranes, then glucose can go into the cell and blood sugar will decrease. Insulin has to bind to receptors to act on a cell. Every cell in the whole body will respond to insulin because every cell needs to take in nutrients to be able to make energy. But there are a few cell types that have more insulin receptors that can respond to excess blood sugar. And these are the fat cells, our liver, and our muscles. So these cells can take up extra sugar, and whatever is not used to make ATP can be stored for later. So there are two processes that I want you to be aware of. One is the production of fat is called lipogenesis. So sugar can be converted into triglycerides to be stored in our adipose tissue, and also stored in the liver, and also a little bit can be stored in the muscles. And then glycogenesis. This is when excess sugar is stored as glycogen, and this primarily occurs in the liver and in the muscles. So how does glucagon increase blood sugar? It is going to do kind of the opposite of the effects of insulin. It is going to stimulate the liver and the fat cells and also the muscles to break down the stored energy, which is in the form of fat or glycogen. Glucagon will break down glycogen to produce glucose, and that process is called glycogenolysis. Lysis means to break down. This happens in the liver and in the muscles. The liver can also produce new glucose out of other molecules like amino acids, and that process is called gluconeogenesis. And then lastly, glucagon can stimulate the breakdown of fat, and that process is called lipolysis, or the breakdown of fat. And then we can use those molecules to produce energy as well. Earlier we talked about how our blood sugar needs to be within a certain range. And when we eat, sugar goes up, and when we're not eating, it goes down, and we make insulin and glucagon, and we want our blood sugar to be in this normal range. Now, when blood sugar is higher than normal, this is called hyperglycemia. When blood sugar is too low, it is called hypoglycemia. And different symptoms are going to be associated with each of these when they're outside of the normal range. And I want to point out that up here, where we have hyperglycemia, this can range in severity from anything from insulin resistance to pre-diabetes to diabetes. So symptoms up here can have a whole range of severity. So let's talk about hypoglycemia first. How would you feel if your blood sugar is too low? If there's a little bit of a lag period between your blood sugar going down and glucagon being produced, or other hormones, there's a bunch of other hormones that also help to increase blood sugar. During that little lag period, or before you eat food, you're going to feel symptoms. Now, how would you feel? Okay, number one, you're going to feel hungry because you don't have enough nutrients moving into the cells. You're going to feel tired, fatigued, and you're going to have brain symptoms as well. You're going to be potentially moody, like hangry. Your cognitive abilities are going to be decreased. It's not as easy to think or concentrate or learn. You might feel dizzy or faint, perhaps a headache. And then there's one other thing that I want to mention. One of the main symptoms of low blood sugar is feeling shaky and anxiety and potentially nausea as well. And why does this happen? This is cool because another hormone that helps us to increase blood sugar is called epinephrine, and that is our adrenaline hormone that we release when we have stress. So if your pancreas has a bit of a lag period before it produces glucagon, then you're going to make epinephrine. Your body sees low blood sugar in the hypoglycemia range as a stress. So then you make epinephrine. And if this happens at nighttime, then it can cause insomnia. Now, how do you feel if you have high blood sugar, hyperglycemia? And again, these symptoms can range in severity depending on if you're just out of the normal healthy range, maybe a little bit of insulin resistance, if you're pre-diabetic and your blood sugar is not perfectly regulated, or if you're diabetic, okay, which is uncontrolled blood sugar. The symptoms are going to range. Now, the main symptoms are going to be thirst. Okay, why is thirst happening? Think about the last time you maybe went to a birthday party and you ate a big pile of sugar, birthday cake, and treats. It makes you thirsty, right? Because glucose is a polar molecule and it attracts water. And when you have high blood sugar, your hypothalamus is going to make you thirsty to try to help dilute that concentration. So having a lot of sugar in your blood makes you thirsty just as much as eating too much salt. Another thing that happens is the kidneys. Now, let's suppose your blood sugar is now in the range where it's not easily regulated. Now the kidneys can't reabsorb all of the sugar that gets filtered. So that means some of the sugar is now going to be released in the urine, and that means you're going to excrete more water. So the next symptom is increased urination. Sometimes high blood sugar can also look like low blood sugar. If your blood sugar is dysregulated in a hyperglycemic way to the point where insulin can't keep up with the blood sugar, then you can have symptoms like fruity breath because of all of the sugar. You will feel hungry. And if you have type 1 diabetes, then that will be associated with weight loss, but type 2 diabetes is associated with weight gain. And that is partly because of the increased hunger. I'm going to talk about those two types in 1 second. And then extreme hyperglycemia is fatal. It can cause unconsciousness, coma, and death. So diabetes that is not treated is fatal. So I want to compare type 1 and type 2 diabetes. These are conditions where blood sugar is not controlled properly. So type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease where the immune cells attack those islet cells in the pancreas that produce insulin. So the beta cells are destroyed and insulin can't be produced, and people with type 1 diabetes have to take insulin. Whereas type 2 diabetes is not caused by a lack of insulin. It's actually caused by an excess of insulin, and that causes a hyporesponsive condition. I want to show you how that works because insulin resistance affects millions of people. Probably 80 million people in North America are pre-diabetic, and most of them are not even aware. And then that can evolve into diabetes, where your pancreas now doesn't even make insulin, and then you need medication. How insulin resistance works is a very important concept because of how many people are impacted. And I'm going to talk about how you might feel if you're starting to have insulin resistance, because there are warning signs. People don't go from totally healthy and perfect blood sugar regulation to being diabetic. Okay, there's a range of symptoms, and if you pay attention to your body and how you feel, you can reverse these things before it gets out of control. So type 2 diabetes is a hyporesponsive disease, and I'm going to show you how that works. In this diagram, we are going to look at a liver cell. And over here we have a blood vessel. So let's say this is a capillary. Our liver cells have these insulin receptors. When we consume food and our blood sugar increases, now we have glucose in our bloodstream that is going to be moving out of the bloodstream, and it needs to go into the cells. How do we move the blood glucose from the blood into the cells? We need to produce insulin. So here we have insulin. And insulin can only impact cells that have a receptor. So insulin will bind to the insulin receptors, and it's going to stimulate the liver cell to produce glucose transporters. When the glucose transporters are now available, now glucose molecules can move into the cell. And when glucose moves into the cell, we can use it to make energy, we can store it as glycogen, or we could store it as fat. And this is a normal process that allows our blood sugar levels to be regulated. Now, what happens when you have insulin resistance? What is going to cause insulin resistance? Let's look at this scenario where now we have large amounts of sugar. When we have high blood sugar on a regular basis, we need to make a lot of insulin. When we make a lot of insulin, what ends up happening is our liver cell here will downregulate all of those insulin receptors. This is a hyporesponsive liver cell. This is insulin resistance because the insulin has no receptors to bind to. When there's no receptors to bind to, that means we also downregulate the glucose transporters. So now very few glucose molecules get into the liver cell. There are many complications that can occur from long-term insulin resistance, which can lead to prediabetes and diabetes. When we have hyperglycemia for a long period of time, we will have things like blood vessel damage. We will have increased blood pressure. That is a risk factor for heart disease. Because sugar damages blood vessels, we have poor wound healing. It affects the brain and the nervous system, and you can have neurological damage. You damage the blood vessels in your retinas, you have an increased risk of blindness. You have an increased risk of kidney failure because of all the capillaries in the kidney that filter the blood. If they become damaged, then you can't regulate excretion. A lot of complications can come from hyperglycemia. Can you reverse type 2 diabetes or prediabetes or insulin resistance? Okay, so the closer you are to the insulin resistant end versus the diabetes end, the easier it is to reverse. What can we do about it? We can definitely do something about it. What is the cause? Insulin resistance happens because of too much sugar in the blood. So, decrease the consumption of sugar. There's a couple of other things that are maybe less obvious. Number one, if you make your muscle cells use blood sugar, exercise. When the blood sugar goes down, insulin receptors will start to come back. And the other thing is taking breaks from eating. We don't have to eat all the time. Our body is very well adapted to delay a meal every now and then. And the last cool little tricky thing that you can do, if you consume your carbohydrates within 2 hours of exercise, your muscle cells will use more of that blood sugar. So have your highest carbohydrate meal of the day right after you work out.